Welcome back to the channel. Make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you never miss an update or a new analysis. Something happened on March 2nd, 2026 that the American financial press buried under stock market noise and Trump's latest tariff tweet. And what got buried is arguably the most consequential economic signal of this decade. Canada, America's single most loyal trade partner, the country that shares 8,900 kilometers of border with the United States, the country whose economy has been structurally fused to the American consumer since before most of your grandparents were born. That country just walked into New Delhi, sat down with India's Prime Minister Modi, and signed the blueprint for a $70 billion economic partnership that requires absolutely zero participation from Washington, zero approval, zero veto, zero American dollar dominance in the transaction chain. And Mark Carney didn't try to hide what he was doing. He said it into a microphone in front of cameras in the diplomatic district of New Delhi. Canada is going all in on diversifying trade away from the United States, not hedging, not exploring options, all in. Let that land for a second before we go into the numbers, because this isn't some emerging economy quietly repositioning on the margins. This is Canada, the United States' second largest trading partner, the country that sends roughly 75% of everything it exports directly into the American economy. That country just announced to the world that it no longer considers American economic stability a reliable enough foundation to build its future around. And it backed that announcement with hard cash, signed agreements, a December deadline, and a decade-long uranium contract. Now, let's get into what was actually signed, because the details are where this story gets genuinely alarming if you're sitting in Washington. Right now, on March 2nd at Hyderabad House in New Delhi, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Prime Minister Narendra Modi signed 5 memorandums of understanding worth a combined $5.5 billion and announced over 10 commercial agreements in total. The stated goal is to more than double bilateral trade from roughly $9 billion in 2024 to $25 to $70 billion annually by 2030. That is not a target. That is a structural commitment backed by signed terms of reference, active chief negotiators, and a hard deadline to finalize a full comprehensive economic partnership agreement, the CEPA, by December 2026. The single biggest piece of this is a $2.6 billion uranium supply deal between the Indian government and Saskatchewan-based Cameco Corporation. Under this agreement, Canada will supply nearly 22 million pounds of uranium to India for civil nuclear energy generation, running from 2027 all the way through 2035. Think about what this actually is. It is a decade-long guaranteed buyer for Canadian natural resources that has nothing to do with American markets, American logistics networks, or American political cycles. India gets fuel for its nuclear program as it scales from 8 gigawatts of nuclear capacity to a target of 100 gigawatts by 2047. Canada locks in a revenue stream that no American president can touch with a tariff threat, an executive order, or a phone call. That is not coincidence. That is engineering. Then there's the technology layer. Indian tech giant HCL Technologies is opening new AI centers in Calgary and Mississauga and expanding operations in Vancouver, scaling Canadian employment from 3,000 to 5,250 jobs. This is high-value, knowledge economy work being deliberately planted on Canadian soil by an Indian company. creating an employment constituency that is now structurally invested in the Canada-India relationship, continuing and deepening. Mumbai-based pharmaceutical companies, OCT Therapies and Jubilant Pharmanova, are establishing manufacturing operations in New Brunswick and Quebec. Elk Valley Resources is moving 1.2 million tons of British Columbia coal directly to Indian buyers. McCain Foods is putting $135 million into expanding its food processing plant in Gujarat, and both governments signed cooperation frameworks covering critical minerals, AI development, semiconductors, renewable energy, space technology, and defense. Here's what I want you to think about right now. Drop your answer in the comments. Do you believe Canada is genuinely breaking away from the United States economically, or is this just a negotiating tactic to get better terms from Washington? Because the answer to that question determines everything about how you read the next 5 years of North American geopolitics. Now, here is what makes this story different from every other trade announcement you've read about in the last year. It is not the size of the deal alone. It's the context behind it that makes this a truly seismic event. 2 years ago, 2 years, not 2 decades, the Canada-India relationship was clinically dead. In September 2023, then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stood in the Canadian Parliament and directly accused agents of the Indian government of assassinating Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Canadian Sikh activist, on Canadian soil in British Columbia. India rejected the accusation completely. Both countries expelled diplomats. Trade negotiations that had been grinding along for 16 years, were frozen entirely. The relationship did not just cool, it collapsed. And yet on March 2nd, 2026, Narendra Modi publicly credited Mark Carney personally for the momentum in the relationship. Modi called Carney "my friend" and described their bilateral trust as having blossomed. The diplomatic rupture of 2023 did not get resolved. The Nijjar case remains open. Carney raised it privately with Modi during their one-on-one meeting, and then they walked out and signed $5.5 billion in agreements anyway. Why? Because both countries needed an alternative to an increasingly unreliable United States far more urgently than they needed to resolve a bilateral dispute with each other. That's the real story. The geopolitical pressure of American unpredictability was large enough to override 2 years of active diplomatic hostility between Canada and India. When the gravitational pull of a collapsing relationship is strong enough to pull 2 countries back together, despite serious unresolved tensions, that tells you something profound about how broken the American partnership has become from both of their perspectives. Let's look at the American side of this equation directly. Trump came back into office in January 2025. Within weeks, he was threatening sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods. Canada, the country that had been America's most integrated trading partner for 30 years under NAFTA and then CUSMA. He called Carney's predecessor a governor of the 51st state. He made the economic relationship between the 2 countries feel contingent, conditional, and politically weaponized in a way it had never been before. What is the rational response to that situation for any Canadian government? You diversify. Immediately, aggressively, and you pick the fastest growing major economy on the planet as your primary alternative destination. India's GDP growth rate averaged 9.4% between 2019 and 2023. It is now the world's 5th largest economy at $3.7 trillion, with a population of 1.4 billion people and a median age of 28. While the United States is aging, politically fractured, and flirting with stagflation, India is young, urbanizing at speed, and building the infrastructure of a modern consumer economy in real time. Every dollar of Canadian exports that flows into that market is a dollar that bypasses Washington's leverage entirely. This is not idealistic diversification. This is cold strategic calculation. And now the detail that serious analysts actually focus on when they look at this agreement, because it's the mechanism that makes this irreversible. The two governments didn't just agree to try to do a free trade deal someday. They signed the terms of reference. On March 2nd, chief negotiators have already met in New Delhi, and the target is a completed, comprehensive economic partnership agreement by December 2026. The CEPA is designed to eliminate tariffs on 99% of goods traded between the two countries. It will cover goods, services, investment flows, agriculture, digital commerce, labor mobility, and sustainable development. Once that agreement is operational, Canadian businesses will have structural incentives to orient toward the Indian market that exist entirely independently of whatever political relationship Canada and the United States happen to have at any given moment. You cannot unbuild a trade architecture once companies, supply chains, financial relationships, and employment bases are organized around it. This is the locked-in mechanism. Carney is not just diversifying Canada's trade for today. He is hardwiring alternative economic infrastructure into the Canadian economy so that future governments, even ones that might want to drift back toward American dependency, will find it structurally difficult to do so. Here is what I genuinely want to know. Put it in the comments. What do you think Washington's actual response to this will be? Will Trump try to punish Canada economically for building these alternatives? Or does he not even understand what just happened in New Delhi? Let's zoom out for a moment and place this inside the broader pattern, because Canada is not doing this alone. This is part of a coordinated global response to American unpredictability that is unfolding simultaneously across multiple continents. Europe has reopened the debate about independent nuclear deterrence for the first time since the Cold War. France is actively expanding its nuclear posture across European partners outside of NATO's American-dominated command structure. Gulf sovereign wealth that spent decades parking itself in dollar-denominated American assets is moving back toward European financial centers as American military adventurism makes the Gulf feel like an operational theater rather than a stable investment environment. And now, Canada, geographically America's closest ally, economically its most integrated partner, culturally its most similar society, is explicitly building economic infrastructure designed to reduce its dependence on American markets. These are not isolated decisions made by 4 or 5 different governments, independently reading their tea leaves. They are a coordinated systemic response to a single root cause: the perception that the United States under Trump is no longer a reliable anchor of the international economic order it built after 1945. Allies watched Trump threaten to abandon NATO commitments. They watched him embrace Putin while Ukraine was actively being bombed. They watched him treat trade agreements like leverage points to be casually discarded rather than binding international commitments. And now they are responding, not with protests, not with speeches at the United Nations, but with signed contracts, hard deadlines, and billions of dollars in committed capital flowing away from American economic orbit. The Canada-India security cooperation element of this deal is particularly revealing. Both governments, announced they are advancing bilateral cooperation on security and law enforcement, specifically focused on fentanyl precursor trafficking and transnational organized crime. Read that carefully. Security cooperation, bilaterally, between Canada and India, directly. This is the kind of framework that has traditionally been mediated through American intelligence sharing architecture. Five Eyes, bilateral security agreements anchored in the American-led alliance system. Canada and India are now building it without that framework. The security layer is being constructed to be just as independent of American participation as the economic layer. Now let me give you the consequence architecture for American economic influence, because this is where it gets structurally serious in ways that go beyond any individual deal. Canada is the United States' second largest trading partner. Total bilateral trade between the US and Canada runs to over $900 billion annually. The American manufacturing sector, automotive, aerospace, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, is deeply integrated with Canadian supply chains in ways that took 30 years to build under NAFTA. When Canada announces it is systematically reducing its dependence on that relationship, the leverage equation changes fundamentally. Previously, when Washington wanted to pressure Ottawa into policy alignment, the implicit threat was always, we can make your economic life very difficult because 75% of your exports come here. That threat loses credibility in direct proportion to how successfully Canada builds alternative markets. Every $1 billion of Canadian exports that flows to India, Japan, Australia, or Europe is $1 billion of reduced exposure to American economic coercion. Within 5 to 7 years, if the CEPA delivers anything close to its targets, Canada's economic relationship with the United States will shift from structural dependency to strategic partnership, important but no longer existential. And once that transition happens, the American ability to extract policy concessions from Canada through economic pressure collapses. The comparison that keeps coming up when you analyze this carefully is what happened to British economic dominance after World War II. As Britain's imperial power weakened, Commonwealth nations, Australia, Canada, India, South Africa, systematically diversified their trade relationships toward regional partners and emerging economies. The transition wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was incremental. Bilateral agreements here, new trade routes there, gradually building economic architecture that simply didn't require British approval or British markets the way it once had. By the time Britain fully understood what had happened, the structural transition was complete and irreversible. Canada is doing the same thing to American economic hegemony right now. The playbook is identical, and the timing of this specific deal cannot be separated from what is happening to the American domestic economy. The United States is currently facing a combination of renewed inflation pressure, rising oil prices linked to its military operations in the Middle East, and a labor market that is showing early signs of contraction. The risk of stagflation, inflation, and recession simultaneously, the worst of both worlds, is rising in ways that serious economists haven't talked about since the 1970s. Carney, who was the governor of the Bank of Canada and then the governor of the Bank of England before becoming Prime Minister, understands monetary economics at a level that most political leaders simply don't. He's not building these alternative trade relationships as a political gesture. He is building them as an economic hedge, positioning Canada to maintain export revenue and employment even if American consumer demand contracts sharply over the next 2 to 3 years. That is central banker thinking applied to foreign policy, and it is ruthlessly rational. Before we get to what this means, for the next 5 years, I want to ask you something directly. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from right now? Whether you're in Canada, the United States, India, or somewhere else entirely, your perspective on this matters, because this story is genuinely global in its implications. Let me give you the 5-year projection that this deal implies, because I think it's more dramatic than most commentators are willing to say directly. By the end of 2026, if the CEPA is signed on schedule, Canada will have tariff-free access to a market of 1.4 billion people, the world's most populous country, the world's 5th largest economy, and the world's fastest-growing major consumer base. Canadian commodity exporters, uranium, coal, potash, lumber, agricultural products, will have price-competitive access to Indian buyers for the first time in the history of the relationship. Canadian technology companies and AI developers will have Indian talent pipelines and Indian market access simultaneously. Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers will have production bases on Canadian soil, creating bilateral supply chain dependencies that make both governments invested in the relationship's stability. Within 3 years of CEPA implementation, Canadian businesses will have restructured supply chains, investment decisions, and hiring plans around the reality of Indian market access. That restructuring is not reversible by any future government. Without enormous economic disruption, the trade architecture will be load-bearing infrastructure for the Canadian economy, the same way American market access has been for the past 3 decades. Once you build that kind of structural dependency into an economy, you don't undo it by changing governments. You don't undo it with a phone call. You don't undo it with tariff threats. And here is the piece of this that Washington should be most alarmed by. Not the $70 billion number, not the uranium deal, not the AI centers, the critical minerals and semiconductor cooperation framework. Canada has extraordinary reserves of the minerals that are essential for the technology economy of the 21st century. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements. The United States has been counting on preferential Canadian access to those minerals as part of its strategy to build semiconductor supply chains that are independent of Chinese dominance. The Canada-India deal specifically includes cooperation frameworks on critical minerals and semiconductors. Canada just signaled that it will build those supply chains with India as a co-partner, not exclusively through American channels and not exclusively for American strategic benefit. The minerals that Washington was counting on as a tool of technological leverage are now being offered into a supply network that India participates in equally. Trump's America First policy was supposed to secure American economic dominance by forcing allies into alignment through economic pressure. What it has actually produced is the systematic construction of economic alternatives by those same allies. Alternatives specifically designed to reduce American leverage. The harder Washington presses, the faster Ottawa builds. The more unpredictable American partnership becomes, the more urgently Canada locks in alternatives. There is a feedback loop operating here, and it is running in exactly the wrong direction from Washington's perspective. Carney and Modi didn't just sign trade agreements in New Delhi on March 2nd, 2026. They signed a joint declaration that one of America's most reliable allies no longer considers American economic stability dependable enough to organize its economic future around. They backed that declaration with $5.5 billion in immediate commercial commitments, a December 2026 deadline for comprehensive tariff-free market access, a decade-long uranium supply contract, AI infrastructure being built on Canadian soil by Indian companies, and pharmaceutical manufacturing being established in Canadian provinces by Indian firms. That is not a negotiating position. That is a strategic decision. Canada just made it. And Washington, if it is paying any attention at all, should understand that the most dangerous thing about this deal is not what it is today. It is what it will be structurally impossible to undo in 2029